This whole U.S.-Colombia thing, it's been everywhere lately, right? It's wild. We've got a ton of news from both sides, even some official statements, plus some background on how these two have gotten along in the past. So, what do you say? Ready to try and figure out just how this whole trade war thing got started?
Absolutely. It's complicated,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think we can put the pieces together, I think, to really get what's happening now. We got to go back to the start of Trump's second term.
Yeah.
Right? From day one, that administration, they made it clear they were taking a hard line on immigration.
Yeah, and you know what really stood out to me? It was the military aircraft for deportations. Like, we're talking C-17 Globemasters, the things they use to move troops and all that. I mean, that's got to be sending a pretty strong message, don't you think?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
It was a show of force,
Mm.
a way of saying, hey, we're serious about this.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember, this isn't happening out of nowhere. The U.S. and Colombia, it's a long and complicated history. Sometimes allies, sometimes tense.
Mm-hmm. So some baggage even before this whole thing blew up. And then Colombia, they just straight up refused to take 2 of these deportation flights. What was the deal with that?
Well, President Petro, he came into office in 2022. He's been really vocal about how migrants are treated. He said the U.S. wasn't treating the people being deported with dignity and respect. And there were even reports of people being handcuffed on these flights. He basically said, look, until you can guarantee humane treatment and we have some real protocols in place, we're not taking these flights.
Wow. That's a pretty big move, especially with how closely they've worked together in the past. I can only imagine how that went over in Washington.
It was a challenge for sure. I mean, it sets a precedent right. Other countries could follow suit. If Colombia, a major ally, is willing to stand up like that, well, what's stopping anyone else?
Well, we saw how Trump reacted, right? He didn't waste any time.
Yeah.
Emergency 25% tariffs on everything from Colombia. And just to turn up the heat even more, travel bans on their officials' visa revocations. The whole 9 yards.
Yeah, that was aggressive, for sure. Meant to inflict some pain. Get Colombia back in line. Classic economic leverage for a foreign policy goal.
So basically a trade war. And what's interesting is Petro, he fired back. He put a 25% tariff on U.S. goods coming into Colombia. And he was publicly criticizing Trump's policies. Even his character. It was like a game of chicken with the stakes way too high.
He wasn't backing down, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But it's a risky move, right? When you look at the difference in economic power.
And then, just as things were getting really intense, Petro does a complete 180. He offered up the Colombian presidential plane to help with deportations. Talk about a plot twist.
It's fascinating, isn't it? What do you think caused that? Was it the pressure of the sanctions, maybe a strategic move to calm things down? Or could there be internal political stuff we don't even know about?
It's a mystery, all right. And here's another piece of that mystery. Remember that U.S. military deportation flight? The one Mexico seemed to turn away? And then there's Brazil. They condemned the U.S. for handcuffing their people on one of those flights. What do you think about all that?
Well, I think there's a pattern here. It looks like there's growing resistance in Latin America to U.S. immigration policy, driven by sovereignty concerns and the treatment of migrants.
So it's not just a U.S.-Colombia thing. This is something bigger. And behind closed doors in Washington, you've got those pushing for even tougher measures, while others are probably worried about alienating allies and sparking a regional crisis. It's a lot to unpack.
It really is. But before we get into all the what-ifs and implications, what stood out to you so far? Anything surprising? Anything you just can't stop thinking about? Petro's initial defiance. Yeah, that's what gets me. To basically tell the U.S., we won't accept your citizens back until you treat them how we demand.
That's bold. It really does feel like something's changing in how the U.S. and Latin America interact.
Right, it's like a turning point. And then other countries started taking a stand too. And don't forget, after that initial rejection of the flights, the U.S. apparently tried to work with Mexico to deport people over land. Oh yeah, that could easily become another problem.
Yeah.
And we have to look at how people within the U.S. reacted too. Some people are praising Trump's hard line, while others are worried about the economic and diplomatic consequences.
Yeah, you see it in how the media is covering it. Some are saying it's about time they crack down on illegal immigration. Others are focusing on the human cost and how a trade war will hurt American consumers.
Exactly. Even within one country, you have such different views. And that complexity, it's in all the themes we see coming out of this situation.
Okay, so let's look at those themes. One that's really obvious is the U.S. using its economic and political power to get its way on immigration. It's like tariffs are a weapon, economic coercion.
Yeah, and that brings up some ethical questions, right? Is it okay to cause economic pain to a whole country just to get what you want?
But then you see the other side, Latin American countries pushing back, saying they're sovereign and their citizens deserve respect.
Exactly. They don't want to just be told, what to do anymore. They're standing up for themselves.
Yeah.
Even if it means their economies suffer.
And we can't ignore the ethical side of all this. The mass deportations, the reports of migrants in handcuffs, the conditions on those flights. It raises concerns about human rights.
It makes us think about how we treat people fleeing tough situations, trying to find a better life, escaping violence. It's uncomfortable.
And then there's the economic impact. If those tariffs stick around, consumers in both countries will feel it. Prices will go up. Businesses will be hurt. It could even slow down economic growth.
It's like a ripple effect. It goes way beyond the governments. It shows that trade wars don't have winners. Everyone pays in the end.
So you've got power diplomacy, human rights, economic interest. It's all tangled up. It's hard to know what'll happen.
One thing's for sure, though. This isn't just about the U.S. and Colombia. This is a symptom of something bigger.
Yeah.
Changes in global power, nationalism rising, people realizing how connected we all are.
It's like we're at a crossroads. The old ways of doing things, who has power and how they use it, it's all being challenged.
And what happens with this U.S.-Colombia thing? It could really affect how the U.S. interacts with Latin America, even the rest of the world.
It's fascinating. A little scary, but fascinating. So much is changing. It's like we're watching history happen. What comes next? Who knows? Makes you wonder what's next, right? What if this keeps up? Other countries keep pushing back against U.S. policies. Could it really change how the U.S. and Latin America, even the whole world, interact?
It's the big question.
Yeah.
And it's not just Latin America either. We see this kind of pushback in other places, too. It really feels like the whole global scene is shifting right in front of us.
Like the U.S., they have all this power, but they can't just call all the shots anymore, right? It feels like things are moving away from that whole one country acting alone thing.
Yeah.
And more towards everyone having a say. Multiple countries, regions. It's a multipolar world or something.
It's messy and complicated.
Yeah.
But also kind of exciting to see. It's like we're watching them redraw the map of global power. And who knows what the new world will even look like.
I think this whole U.S.-Colombia thing, it shows us some big questions we got to answer. As a global community, I mean, what about the ethics of mass deportations? How we treat migrants? Using economics as a tool in foreign policy. How do we balance what a country wants to do versus working together? Tough questions, right?
And ones we can't just ignore anymore.
Yeah.
This deep dive, it's like a peek into a world that's changing, where the old rules are falling apart and new ones are being written.
So as we keep following this story, and others like it, it's good to keep those questions in mind. Challenge what you think. Look at it from different angles. Don't be afraid to ask the tough questions.
Because those answers, when we find them, they're going to shape the world we live in for a long time.
Well, that's about it for our deep dive into this whole U.S.-Colombia situation. We hope it gave you something to think about. Maybe even made you a little uncomfortable. Sometimes the important stuff, it does that. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those questions, and keep diving deep.